When the Great War ended in November 1918, it set in motion a train of events that reshaped the world. Leaning toward isolationism, the United States turned inward. With surprise and shock, one event changed everything. One man wrote in his diary that Pearl Harbor ended isolationism for any realist. His name was Arthur Vandenberg, a former newspaper publisher who became a United States Senator almost by accident. He called himself the luckiest man alive, the very model of a senator with white hair and an owlish look. He was described by one journalist as the pouter pigeon with the Kewpie smile. This is the story of America's capacity for change and how one politician became a statesman as he helped shape the world by defining America's new role in it.
More progress toward unification has been made in a few months than in centuries preceding. This is progress for peace and freedom, for us as well as them. It is the greatest possible insurance against the war we do not want.
What an introduction to a great documentary. I'm Gleaves Whitney. I'm director of the Hauenstein Center for Presidential Studies here at Grand Valley, and I'm very delighted that you all joined us for this private world premiere of this documentary based on Arthur Vandenberg. There are so many people who helped make this evening possible that I want to acknowledge them right away. First of all, I want to say a word of thanks to Ralph Hauenstein, who could not be with us this evening. But as Ralph likes to say, he was 10 years old when Hank began his book of Vandenberg. And then we have a number of people who helped fund this project, and their support over the last 5.5 years has meant so much to us. I want to thank the Meyer Foundation, the Fry Foundation, the Belden Fund, Marianne Keeler for her support, and also Grand Valley State University for sustaining support as well. So thank you to all. Let's give a hand to those groups. Then I am very pleased that we have some distant relatives of Arthur Vandenberg who are with us this evening, and I would very much appreciate it if you would stand up and be acknowledged. I think it's this row right here, please. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. You all were very shy about that, but this is an evening you can be very proud of. We did a lot to pull this together. I've been very honored to work with the gentlemen who are in those chairs. You know, Hank Meyer, Mike Grass, and I, as I say, we've been working on this for 5.5 years, 38,000 miles of travel, 27 interviews with top-notch people who understood the life of Arthur Vandenberg and his role in shaping the world that we experience today. And America's Senator, the unexpected odyssey of Arthur Vandenberg, will really round that out for you. Now, I want to put you at ease. We're not going to try to show you the whole thing. You'd be here 6 hours if we did that. What we're going to do instead is show about 39, 40 minutes of the documentary. We're going to break it up into 5 segments, and we're going to have the opportunity then to engage in a little bit of conversation between the segments, and at the end open it up to questions for you to put to Hank and Mike and to myself if you wish. So we're really excited to premiere this evening, and I would like to just acknowledge a couple of other people here who've been supportive through this whole process. I want to acknowledge our president at Grand Valley, Tom Haas. Thank you so much for your support. President Emeritus Don Lubbers, thank you for your moral support through this. And also, I'd like to acknowledge Mary Beth Wardrop, Vice President of Development here at Grand Valley. Mary Beth, thank you very much. Thank you very much. And with that, I'm going to join these gentlemen, but first just a word about them. Really pleased that Hank Meyer could be with us this evening. You know, Hank needs no introduction in this community. You all know, everybody in this room knows what Hank and his family have just been through, so we're very pleased that you were able to join us, and our heart goes out to you and your family. So thank you for being here this evening.
Thank you, Gleaves, and this is a treat, and I hope a time when we can enjoy ourselves. Mike Grass approached me about this project more than 5 years ago. He had done Time and Chance, his PBS documentary on the life of Gerald Ford, and was aware of my interest in Arthur Vandenberg, an interest that owes a lot to Gordon Olson, our former city historian, and his wife Chris is with us tonight. Gordon had worked with me, was putting together the program for the State Historical Society of Michigan's annual conference way too long ago to be mentioned here. Ralph Hauenstein was a little older than 10, but not much. And I had just finished writing a biography of my grandfather, and also my cousin Louise's grandfather, who's here tonight. And Gordon knew of my interest in biography. There had been a biography of Arthur Vandenberg, the first of what was going to be 2 volumes that had been published back in the late 1970s. And Gordon said, well, I'm putting together the program for this conference, and why don't you do something on Arthur Vandenberg? And I said, well, he doesn't need another biography. There's one already in the works. He said, well, just pick a facet of his career, which I did. I talked about his attempt to keep America neutral when World War II broke out. And then 2 weeks after that conference, 20 years ago, I get a call from the daughter of this professor in Chicago who'd been working on the biography. And it turns out he had died, and he'd had a rather difficult life, and his adult daughter was closing up his home and trying to figure out what to do with all his research for his unwritten 2nd volume. It had no monetary value. This was stuff from the Truman Library, the Roosevelt Library, the British Foreign Office, the State Department archives. But she couldn't find anybody to take it, and no libraries were interested, so she called the Historical Society of Michigan and said, do you know anybody who has an interest in Arthur Vandenberg? And they said, well, we just had this speaker a couple of weeks ago. And I ended up bringing a van load of papers back to our office and coming back also with a real sense of mission. And so that mission is yet to be fulfilled. I hope it's close. I'm negotiating with myself about a sabbatical right now. But in the meantime, Mike heard of this and approached me, and that got us started. Arthur Vandenberg's life started about a mile from here over on Washington Street, and it ended about a mile from here over on Morris Avenue. And in between, he had an impact on the world that is not always well remembered. And so that engaged us in this process, and the results are here tonight.
Thank you very much, Hank. And let me just say a word also about the producer and writer of this documentary, Mike Grass, sitting here, who's closest to the center of the stage, brought a lot of creative talent and energy and just hard work to pull this together. And the team he assembled of technical folks to make this sing, this documentary sing, and be truly a special on PBS. So, Mike, thank you very much for all of your work to do this as well. So let's give him a hand. And with that, I think I'm going to sit down now so that we can start the documentary. Enjoy the evening.
Arthur Vandenberg's father owned a struggling harness shop in downtown Grand Rapids. He was a true believer in the city's moral code of thrift and hard work, a conviction that would inspire a future president who grew up in the same neighborhood.
Both Arthur Vandenberg and Gerald Ford come from West Michigan, which is a deeply conservative area. Both these men, Arthur Vandenberg and Gerald Ford, are cut from the same cloth in that respect.
At Central High School, young Vandenberg was notorious for his speech-making, a talent that would later be described as the windy rhetoric of a positive thinker.
He loved to talk, and he had a great command of the English language, but sometimes he would get carried away.
He was swept away by politics as well, In fact, he lost his job at the biscuit factory in Grand Rapids as a young man when Teddy Roosevelt came to town. There was a big parade, and for a 16-year-old kid in love with politics, he couldn't resist, and he left his desk and he lost his job.
After a year at the University of Michigan, Vandenberg dropped out, signing on as a cub reporter at the Grand Rapids Herald. At just 22, he became editor. That same year, 1906, he married Elizabeth Watson, his high school sweetheart. His progressive attitude toward both foreign and domestic policy had been shaped by the hero of his generation, Teddy Roosevelt, and he supported Woodrow Wilson in 1917, when the president asked for a declaration of war against Germany. Vandenberg painted the First World War as the greatest revival the world has ever known since Christ came upon the earth.
In 1917, before most of you fighting men were born, our fathers fought the First World War to make the world safe for democracy, for the common man. They fought a good fight.
World War I was a war of great moral rhetoric. They spoke of victory, they spoke of the fallen, they spoke of the foe, and Vandenberg himself used bombastic language. He spoke of a crusade.
The Great War was a crusade that he could join only in spirit. All he could do was give speeches and sell war bonds. In 1916, his wife had died, his very young wife, of a brain tumor, leaving him with 3 small children. His world was turned upside down. He could no more make sense of his own personal tragedy than he could of the carnage across the sea.
When Woodrow Wilson proposed a league to bind nations together in an idealistic world association, Vandenberg recoiled, fearing the entangling alliances George Washington had warned against in his farewell address. From his desk in Grand Rapids, Vandenberg's editorials and advice helped defeat the League of Nations and put Warren Harding in the White House. He had achieved a modest degree of success as the author of 3 flowery books inspired by his admiration for Alexander Hamilton, whom he called the greatest American. Vandenberg wrote 100 short stories, as well as the lyrics for 2 published songs under the pen name A.V. Hendrick.
Just the other evening I was handed quite a treat. I got tired strolling through the park and took a seat.
In 1918, he married again, Hazel Whittaker, whom he'd met in Ann Arbor 16 years earlier. His regional values helped shape his cautiously progressive politics. He believed in honest government. He promoted the elimination of waste and extravagance. He advocated repayment of the national debt, lower taxes, and a strong national defense. Vandenberg disliked reactionary conservatism. He championed labor's right to organize, the protection of women and children from industrial exploitation, and he railed against corporate monopoly, the trusts that Teddy Roosevelt had fought against. Encouraged to run for governor, Vandenberg vowed to fulfill his childhood dream to become a United States Senator. By the middle of the Roaring '20s, Arthur Vandenberg had become publisher and part owner of the Grand Rapids Herald, as it joined with other Michigan dailies to form a flourishing chain. Now he was a millionaire, looking for his next opportunity.
Well, with that introduction, I would like to put a question starting with you, Hank. Could you please tell us what inspired you to get so interested in Arthur Vandenberg and to write a biography about him?
I've said before, and I like to say, I think he may be the most influential public figure of the 20th century for whom no complete biography exists. And that in itself just piqued my curiosity, apart from the fact that he was a Grand Rapids boy, went to public high school here, ran cross country in high school, and that sort of parochial passion was a part of it too.
Very good. And Mike, what inspired you to take the manuscript that Hank's been working on and turn that into a documentary?
Well, after I'd done the Ford documentary, I figured the next logical politician about whom a film could be made would be Vandenberg, and I knew Hank was writing the book, and I, through an intermediary, approached him. We had coffee, and he said, let's do it, and then we approached the Hauenstein Center and made them a partner in this, and the rest is kind of history. I did want to say, it's kind of a cute story. Gleaves is correct that this took a long time to do. It started 5.5 years ago, and a couple of years ago, I was out doing some research at Meyer headquarters. Hank has a kind of a hermetically sealed room out there, which is a Vandenberg room where he has all of his memorabilia and documents and photographs, and I was doing some research out there, and I left the door open, and who walks by but Fred Meyer? And he kind of poked his head in, and he said, who are you and what are you doing? And I told him who I was, and I said I was doing some research on a film that your son Hank and I are producing. I said, maybe you know something about that. And he said, oh yeah, I know all about that. I only have one question. Are you ever going to finish it? So it has taken a while, but we did travel around the country. We went to Austin, Texas, Los Angeles, New York City, Washington, D.C., Nashua, New Hampshire, Ithaca, New York, and of course Grand Rapids. To do our interviews, we interviewed 27 people, and it started out as a 1-hour documentary. And we realized in a fairly short period of time that there was no way you could tell the story of Arthur Vandenberg or the 1930s and 1940s in an hour, so it went to 90 minutes. And then Hank kept piling on all these interviews. I said, well, you know who we really ought to interview is so-and-so. We ought to go out and get George McGovern or whatever. And so we just kept interviewing people, and it went to almost 2 hours, just shy of 2 hours. But I think it's a good 2 hours. I hope you watch it tomorrow night.
You know, this is a good segue, Mike, because this is a global story with deep local roots. And I'm curious, how did researching Arthur Vandenberg get you, Hank, to see our area here in West Michigan through different eyes?
Well, it's hard to appreciate today, but in that age when newspapers were the dominant medium, when you didn't have to feel like you were an outsider when you lived in Grand Rapids, that Washington was some remote place. In 1912, at the Lincoln Day dinner here in Grand Rapids, William Howard Taft announced his candidacy for the presidency. Vandenberg was editor of the Grand Rapids Herald when Warren Harding was editor of the Marion Star, a little paper in northern Ohio. So they knew each other from the newspaper business, and when the smoke-filled room in Chicago nominated Harding to run for president, Vandenberg was writing his most important speeches on foreign policy and helping elect Harding. Vandenberg would spend his summers out at Ottawa Beach in a cottage that was part of a compound owned by a fellow named George Getz, who was a coal magnate from Chicago, who ran the Republican National, was finance director for the Republican National Committee. Harding's campaign manager was a fellow named Will Hayes. Some of you remember the Hayes Commission from the movie business, who was out of Indianapolis. These folks were in and out of Grand Rapids and in neighboring states all the time. These were the people in part running the country. So he was very connected. There's a great story in the Grand Rapids Herald of William Howard Taft, who you remember as our portliest president, at Kent Country Club for a luncheon and teeing off from the veranda at Kent and taking off his waistcoat and stripping down to his shirt. So you didn't have to feel unconnected here. What was happening in Grand Rapids was resonating around the country.
Great connection there. And Mike, I have a similar question for you. Here you're trying to bring this story together. It's a global story, and yet Grand Rapids is at the epicenter of this story. What were the challenges to you as a documentary filmmaker?
Well, the Vandenberg's personal papers reside at the Bentley Library in Ann Arbor. There are some artifacts and papers at the downtown Grand Rapids Public Library, but the best stuff I found was was not in Grand Rapids. It was at the National Archive, Library of Congress, the Truman Library in Independence, and the District of Columbia Historical Society. So I spent a lot of time in D.C., and I think they may end up naming a wing after me. I spent so much time there, but I had an archivist who worked with me, and her name was Susan Hormuth, and she located a lot of the film that you see, and I located over 900 photographs and scanned them all, and of course we didn't use them all, but there is, once you get into Vandenberg's life, there's a great body of work. You just have to know where to find it.
Very good. Well, let's watch the next segment.
Wartime Washington was the red-hot center of activity in America. It was the headquarters of the war effort. Now, the British were obsessed with anybody that had presidential aspirations.
And that certainly meant Arthur Vandenberg, whose Senate leadership and isolationist convictions made him a serious GOP prospect to challenge Roosevelt. And so the British were concerned.
They knew that Roosevelt's health was much worse than the public was made aware of. They monitored his failing health obsessively, and they kept a very thick file on anyone who could possibly be a contender for that office. So Vandenberg was someone that they were very interested in targeting and keeping an eye on, and they recruited any number of people to keep tabs on him during the whole run of the war.
Under orders from Roosevelt, FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover had already opened an office in Grand Rapids to monitor Vandenberg's activities.
I was sitting at my desk as city editor of the Herald, and in walked this chap, and he introduced himself as from the FBI, and he'd been one of the deputies of J. Edgar Hoover. I was surprised that he got so frank with me as to tell me that he'd been sent there, obviously for political reasons, and opened up this office because they were scared to death that Vandenberg was running against Roosevelt for the next presidency.
England was being just pounded nightly by the Germans. Their coastal cities were being blitzed, and they were suffering. So they needed to keep America's attention focused on their plight throughout the war.
Despite the propaganda and confusion of recent months, it is now obvious that England is losing the war.
They agreed that Roosevelt would give his tacit permission for a few British spies to come in. He would ask Hoover to look the other way, and the British would come in and try and create close cooperation between their countries and between their countries' intelligence communities.
That secret relationship was known as the British Security Cooperation, or BSC.
It was essentially a massive, covert campaign to push America into the war and convert the country into interventionism. And that covert campaign had to be done through propaganda, through political subversion, through sabotage, through any means at their disposal. It was a dirty trick squad in America, essentially. They harassed isolationist senators. They were not above blackmailing them. And the BSC very much targeted Vandenberg.
Much of their work took place within Washington's social circles and lavish dinner parties frequented by the Vandenbergs, where British spies picked up on a tidal wave of Capitol Hill gossip.
They had a whole shadow force of spies, underground network of spies who would attend these parties, who had good cover as embassy officials, air attaches like Roald Dahl, naval heroes and figures like Ian Fleming. You might have singers or entertainers like Noel Coward. All of these different types of characters would go to these parties. It was very glamorous, it was a good dinner, it was free, and there would be a lot of interesting people. So everybody went. And Vandenberg was a regular at these parties, and the British would be all too delighted to have an opportunity to sit next to him and politely have a lovely lady pump him for his attitude towards the war and his attitude towards, say, the Lend-Lease Bill, which was very controversial and pending before the House, and try and pick his brain.
One of those ladies who moved in Vandenberg's circles was Danish-born Mitzi Sims, the sultry wife of a wealthy Canadian diplomat who worked in the code room at the British Embassy.
Both Mitzi Sims and her husband were friends with William Stevenson, the Canadian entrepreneur who was the head of the British Security Coordination, and certainly they had been asked by him unofficially to keep an eye on Vandenberg. Vandenberg was, because of his isolationist views, enemy number one as far as Stevenson was concerned.
The Simses were also neighbors of Arthur and Hazel Vandenberg and soon became fast friends. Mitzi was a jet-setter before there were jets, one of her nieces observed.
Mitzi Sims was very intelligent, very charming, very persuasive, shall we say. And she went a long way to trying to soften his hardline isolationist views and move him to a more international position. And it became well known in Washington that they had a very close relationship. In fact, so close at one point that Vandenberg installed her in an apartment next to his in the Wartime Park, and that had tongues wagging all over Washington.
On the eve of America's entry into the First World War, the ordered life of a young Arthur Vandenberg had been shattered by the death of his first wife. On the eve of a second great conflict, Arthur Vandenberg, a power in the Senate but on the wrong side of the aisle, found his household in turmoil again. Early in 1940, the Senate's senior isolationist, William Borah, the Lion of Idaho, died. He'd been Vandenberg's mentor, his hero since the younger senator's days at the Grand Rapids Herald. Vandenberg delivered Borah's eulogy to a nationwide radio audience. Now it was he who was the undisputed leader of Republican isolationists.
Just a few months after Borah's death, Mitzi Sims's husband Harold died. Some said he was actually the first Washington casualty of the war, if indeed he'd been running the code room at the British Embassy. Mitzi was adrift, Vandenberg's marriage was in deep trouble, and England was hanging on by a thread.
This was a matter of life and death for the British. Their very survival was at stake.
Despite England's plight, despite his deepening relationship with Mitzi Sims that led commentator Walter Winchell to dub him the Senator from Michigan, Vandenberg clung to his isolationist principles. And with the election on the horizon, Roosevelt could not escape the curse of neutrality.
Well, here we get into the salacious material. I think this is fascinating. A lot of American audiences don't realize a number of the things that were pointed out in this segment. First of all, the extent to which there were British spies in this country before Pearl Harbor. I think that takes many of us aback. And then the second thing is, of course, the potential public scandal between Senator Vandenberg and Mitzi. And I'm just curious, as a biographer, you're trying to uncover the story, the truth of the story. Your challenge is to get at that truth. Who talks, who doesn't talk, what sources are reliable, unreliable?
Well, and as we're showing the film in snippets, we take that snippet out of a larger context because it's fun to talk about without wanting to overplay its significance. But I interviewed a couple of very elderly former society columnists in Washington, D.C., one of whom was convinced that the affair was merely platonic, that Hazel kept a close eye on Arthur, and the other of whom said, no, I remember, she was riding around. they were riding around together in a convertible very publicly. And finally, Senator Vandenberg had 3 children. His youngest daughter became a close friend in her last years. And she didn't want to talk about it for a long time. And then finally she said, no, my dad really got at the point where he had to decide to stay or to go in his marriage. And it meant a lot to him if I would send a Christmas card to Mitzi, and he didn't know what to do. And she said, yeah, and they did keep a post office, a separate postal box at the Wardman Park for their own confidential communications. So it was clearly a serious affair. At the same time, did it really affect his policy? I don't think so. I think the British were there as spies, but they really weren't able to influence him that way. It may have influenced his political ambitions. It may have made him more reluctant to seek the presidency again after 1940, but I don't think it finally changed his views and his policies.
And Mike, from your point of view as a documentary filmmaker here, you're dealing with information that can be difficult to get at. What were the challenges for you? And
well, there's not a lot of information out there, or in particularly artifacts or photographs about Mitzi Simmons, but I did find photographs at the District of Columbia Historical Society about the parties, and these were notorious parties in Georgetown that the Vandenbergs would have attended, and found a few photographs in Arthur Vandenberg's personal papers, and there's only a couple in the Library of Congress, and we did try to find something in Montreal because that's where she was from, but we had no luck. But so what you saw there is about all that exists. But it was a real needle in a haystack.
Well, and I probably 15 years ago, I spoke to an audience at the Women's City Club, and some of the very elderly at the time ladies there came up to me afterwards and said, we all felt so sorry for Hazel. And so that there was a sense of a general awareness, even though people didn't talk about it as much.
And also, our friend Ralph Hauenstein has a very interesting segment in this. And Hank, if you would elaborate just a little bit about what happened, with the G-man who came to Grand Rapids.
Well, this was another wonderful piece of news, and it's all courtesy of Ralph. I mean, here we are in the late 1930s. The Depression is still going, and Grand Rapids, of all places, gets a new FBI office. There really wasn't, this wasn't a center of gangland activity, Frank McKay notwithstanding, that would have justified establishing an FBI office. But so far into our system did politics reach that Roosevelt was genuinely concerned, and boy, let's get some background material on this guy.
And I've got to add that when Ralph tells this story, the FBI man comes to him there at the Grand Rapids Herald and says, Mr. Hauenstein, I want to go and look in your morgue and get any information I can. Ralph stood right up to him and said, no way, you're not doing it while I'm here. So that was also, I think, indicative of Ralph's sense of integrity where he worked. All right, did you want to add?
I just wanted to set up the next piece we're going to show. And I think this is another really interesting part of Vandenberg's life. There's an old saying that no war can be won without propaganda. And thanks to our friend Gordon Olson, he put us onto a film called Fellow Americans, and it was narrated by Jimmy Stewart, and it's a piece of propaganda that was produced right after Pearl Harbor. And Garson Kanin from Hollywood was the producer, and they targeted select cities in the United States, supposedly who had lost a son or daughter to the Pearl Harbor attack. But we surmise, but we can't prove it, that they targeted cities with isolationist politicians whom they were trying to turn to support the war. Because if you remember, even after Pearl Harbor, there were still isolationists out there who said we should not get involved in the war. So What we're going to show you now is a little bit of Fellow Americans narrated by Jimmy Stewart. So we can roll that now.
The country and the Congress rallied around the flag after Pearl Harbor.
Fellow Americans, consider the skies of Michigan. These airy heights, these swift bird flights, these children's kites. How peaceful the skies of Michigan.
After the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941, Hollywood movie makers produced Fellow Americans, a film designed to rally support for the war.
As the bomb fell, these kids were shooting marbles for keeps. They didn't see it. As the bomb struck, the junior league was playing bridge. They didn't feel it hit. Where the bomb exploded...
Fellow Americans director Garson Kanin trained his cameras on select U.S. cities that had lost a son or daughter to the infamous attack.
After exhaustive search, it has been found impossible to locate your son, Raymond D. Boynton, Seaman Second Class, United States Navy. The department expresses to you its sincerest sympathy.
One such city was Grand Rapids, Michigan.
A few weeks ago, one ordinary Grand Rapids day, a bomb fell. Yes, here in Grand Rapids, a bomb fell on the furniture center of the USA. Someone was killed, someone of Grand Rapids. As the bomb struck...
But perhaps furniture was not the only reason Kanin chose Grand Rapids. This was also the home of Senator Arthur H. Vandenberg, one of the most influential members of the United States Congress, and before Pearl Harbor, an outspoken isolationist. Republican in party, yet what he called unpartisan in spirit, Vandenberg championed problem-solving in Washington. For him, compromise and consensus trumped conflict and discord. But Roosevelt played his cards so close to his vest that Vandenberg's distrust grew. FDR conducted much of U.S. foreign policy in secret, with only passing regard for Congress or even his own State Department. There was no love lost between these longtime rivals. Vandenberg denounced FDR for operating a private war in Europe. He said that Roosevelt, as commander-in-chief, had become his own Secretary of State. The seeds for an imperial presidency had been planted. As war raged across Europe and the Pacific, Vandenberg and the Republicans, so long in the minority and somewhat discredited for their pre-war positions, began to ponder plans for the post-war world. Vandenberg wanted to prevent competing visions of the future from tearing his party apart, and it was apparent that the world would be dramatically different after the war.
So what Vandenberg came to realize in the early 1940s is that he could protect, he could uphold the one thing he cared most about, which was U.S. freedom of action. And there was something very closely related to that he was concerned about, and that was the role of the United States Congress in determining the policies and how that freedom of action was to be used.
If the U.S. was going to assume global leadership after World War II, it needed a foreign policy that transcended political parties. It was that sort of consensus that Vandenberg understood so well. He knew what it meant to work together with the opposition.
Politics stops at the water's edge, as I said, and that we're going to fight as fiercely as before over domestic issues, but when we deal with the world, we're going to deal with it as one.
That bipartisan spirit didn't happen on its own. It was forged by leaders who understood the connection between values and ideas on one side and the responsibilities of great power status on the other.
Vandenberg really provided the linchpin for internationalist Republicans and for Democrats to come together in a politics-free environment, essentially. The big question was, well, when the war ends, are we going to go back to that debate again? Are we going to retreat back into isolationism?
That challenge was put to the test in the late summer of 1943. Like Vandenberg, Republican National Chairman Harrison Spangler feared that disputes over foreign policy might split the party in the 1944 presidential election. Spangler called for the formation of a post-war advisory council to meet on Mackinac Island in northern Michigan. He asked Vandenberg to chair the council's Committee on Foreign Policy. Vandenberg's assignment: prepare a statement that both the internationalist and isolationist wings of the party could live with, a goal most observers thought impossible.
I was really a hick out of Texas, so going to Mackinac Island was a big thrill. There was a big conference up there where they were going to try to bury the isolationism that had been the Republican Party. Esther Tufte, my boss, and she wanted me to be able to cover Senator Vandenberg, who was, of course, a key source for her. And we became aware of the fact that Vandenberg, who was trying to piece together an acceptable resolution, would take them one at a time and walk them back and forth up and down that porch. And we soon discovered that, and we flattened ourselves on the floor, and we could see them from the knees down, and we had a pad and pencil in hand. We were right at the point where he would march them up there and then turn them around and talk to them, and we could catch a few words of what he was up to. I'm amazed there aren't still some footmarks there.
Footprints that marked the end of isolationism and the beginning of a new internationalist worldview.
Somebody said they were going to call FDR and tell him we were doing this, and then they came back and let us know that, you know, he had gotten a big kick out of the fact that we were spying.
Drafted by Vandenberg and a handful of colleagues, the historic Mackinac Charter cleared the way for later Republican support of the United Nations. Vandenberg, the recent isolationist, considered it a major accomplishment. I continue to believe, he wrote, that when I succeeded in putting 49 prima donnas together at Mackinac, I discovered the necessary formula.
This documentary and the book that Hank is writing is really about three odysseys as I see it. Most obviously, it's about the odyssey of the senator, but it's also the odyssey of the Republican Party that changes during this war in a significant degree to become a bipartisan body that can unite with Democrats across the aisle to fight the worst war in human history in two theaters. But the third odyssey is indeed this passage of the United States from being isolationist to a nation that favors neutrality to one of collective security and world responsibility. And Hank, what I'd like to ask you at this point is, what does this say about Arthur Vandenberg's qualities of leadership, his capacity for leadership, that he played such a pivotal role in our nation and a Republican Party's transition?
Well, because he'd been an isolationist for so long, he had tremendous credibility with Americans who traditionally didn't want to have anything to do with conflicts across the sea. And so as a politician and as a statesman, he was able to both lead people in a new direction and reflect their feelings in a way that people who had always been advocates of American intervention weren't able to do. And I think he was both the leader and the reflector of a large segment of public opinion that needed to be brought along for the United States to be a different country after the war.
And Mike, I'd put a similar question to you. I mean, this was an intellectually rewarding section to work on, and that interview with Liz Carpenter down in Austin, I think for all three of us, was one of the high points, because you see in her explanation this 5'0" reporter there on the floor, and as Vandenberg would march these Republican senators down the veranda, he would turn the person, the party, and then the country around from isolation to this world responsibility. And again, as a filmmaker, how does as a producer, take these metaphors and these ideas and embody them so well to tell the story?
There wasn't a lot of material available about the Mackinac Conference. We found a few photos, and it wasn't until we interviewed Liz Carpenter in Austin, Texas, that she told us this great story. And unfortunately, she passed away in 2010. But you may know Liz Carpenter as being one of the press secretaries for LBJ, and Lady Bird Johnson. It's ironic that Democrats like Liz Carpenter had the nicest things to say about Arthur Vandenberg. And it just happened that way. Because some people have asked us, why did you have so many Democrats in your documentary? And our answer is that it just happened that way because when you watch it tomorrow night, you'll see other people, Congressman Dingell and George McGovern and some others. But anyway, back to the Grand Hotel, because there was no film available of Vandenberg marching these guys up and down the porch of the Grand Hotel, we hired an artist, Milt Klingensmith, to do some artwork on what it might have looked like. And that story that Liz Carpenter tells of being on their stomachs in this presidential suite at the Grand Hotel, watching what was going on, is really a piece of history. And the fact that she says isolationism literally died, she's surprised that the footprints still aren't there on the porch, because you can make a case that that is where isolationism died for the Republican Party.
Well, and Mike, you mentioned all the Democrats on the film. Now, that's not because Vandenberg ceased to be an ardent Republican, but it's because John Dingell was a page in Congress when his father was in Congress, so he knew him as a young man, and it was, and George McGovern is a historian by training, so they had other reasons than partisan.
And Gore Vidal.
Yes, well, and he was no fan of Vandenberg either, of course.
Right. Yeah, that was another great story that the three of us went out and hung out with Gore Vidal for an afternoon in Hollywood, and he was more interested in talking about himself than he was about Arthur Vandenberg. He's a real flamethrower, so, but he does make a couple of appearances in the film.
Gore Vidal also had possibly one of the funniest lines of all when we were interviewing, and as already mentioned, Gore Vidal was no fan of Vandenberg, and I'll never forget, Gore Vidal in his inimitable way said, you know, if you just flattered Vandenberg a little, he would be your flower boy at your wedding.
But he also featured Vandenberg as a fairly major character in his novel Washington, D.C., and in his chronicle of historical novels.
Yes. Well, I think we're ready for the next segment.
Just as a preview, and before we roll it, you probably are aware that one of the hallmarks of Vandenberg's career is that he helped write the charter for the United Nations. And that's one of his great accomplishments. And the next section we're going to show you is called Town Meeting of the World. And it's about the founding of the United Nations and Vandenberg's role in it. And you'll see an interview with a fellow that we discovered in a rest home in Nashua, New Hampshire. His name is Larry Finkelstein. And he was the scribe at the 1945 San Francisco conference, and literally sat across the table from Vandenberg and took notes of the American delegation. And he's still with us, and got an email from him just a few days ago that he's very intrigued to see the film. And he's one of he and Ralph Hauenstein, I think, and Gore Vidal are three of the people who are still living who actually met Arthur Vandenberg.
And Gore Vidal did because his grandfather was a senator from Oklahoma who was blind. And so Gore, as a teenager, living with his grandparents as his mother was going through a divorce, accompanied his grandfather to a couple of political conventions and other functions, and so met Vandenberg as a teenager.
In this section, you'll also see Gillian Martin Sorensen, who at the time was with the UN Foundation. She is of Grand Rapids. She was married to Ted Sorensen. And then the other interview is with Stephen Schlesinger, son of Arthur Schlesinger Jr., who is a United Nations scholar. So we can roll that now.
We must not be impatient. It took 5 years to take the world apart. It would not be surprising if it took at least that long to put it together again.
The groundwork for the founding of the United Nations had been laid long before Roosevelt returned from Yalta. Although his health was failing, FDR moved ahead with plans for a UN conference that had been hammered out at Washington's Dumbarton Oaks mansion the previous autumn. Now the path to peace, perhaps bringing an end to global war, would run through San Francisco. To ensure a bipartisan U.S. delegation to draft a UN charter, Roosevelt was persuaded to reach out to his longtime adversary, Arthur Vandenberg.
Roosevelt told Vandenberg that he had come back from Yalta, convinced that Stalin could not be trusted to keep his word. And that, moreover, that he wanted Vandenberg to go to San Francisco.
Roosevelt understood that it was necessary to make American post-war policy, like American wartime policy, a bipartisan sort of thing. Roosevelt, after 12 years in office, really was looking toward his legacy, not what he had done, but how that would project into the future. And it was very necessary to have the support of people like Arthur Vandenberg for those policies.
He, FDR, believed Vandenberg was uniquely positioned. He had the clout. He had the moral authority that came from this conversion, so recently dramatized and alluded to at Yalta, that he was the one man, in effect, that Roosevelt wanted in the American delegation to keep people honest and to keep an eye on the Soviets.
Woodrow Wilson's failed League of Nations still haunted FDR.
Roosevelt had personally witnessed that mess, and he wanted his United Nations to get off to a good start with bipartisan support. And where you look for that, he knew. Old Arthur Vandenberg, all you had to do was flatter him, and he would be, flower boy at your wedding.
Once he'd made the choice of Vandenberg, going through Roosevelt's mind was, let's see what we can do to placate this guy, because he could, bust apart the whole operation out in San Francisco.
It was quite deliberate that he reached out to Republican Arthur Vandenberg and also another powerful senator, Tom Connally from Texas. It's interesting because the Secretary of State, Stettinius, led the delegation, and in all the photographs you will see him at the center and Vandenberg and Connally on either side. That had an important symbolic value. It sent a message that we are in this together, that partisan differences should be set aside. This is a joined effort.
But Vandenberg insisted on being an independent voice in San Francisco.
Vandenberg said, look, I'm a loose cannon. I won't join this delegation unless I am free.
Roosevelt assured Vandenberg of his independence and of his vital role as a hard-headed negotiator, as well as a symbol of bipartisanship.
Part of what brought about his insistence on these terms was a desire to show that the Republicans could also have an impact on the formulation of this treaty.
Franklin Roosevelt died just 2 weeks before the UN conference was scheduled to begin. For a generation of Americans, FDR was the only president they'd ever known. Harry Truman, the junior senator from Missouri, elected vice president only months earlier, was an enigma. FDR had barely bothered to brief him on the dramatic plans taking shape in post-war policy. "You're the one in trouble now," Eleanor Roosevelt told Truman the day her husband died.
The first couple days of the Truman presidency were not reassuring.
The gravest question mark in every American heart is about Truman, Vandenberg wrote in his diary. Can he swing the job?
So Vandenberg had good reason to doubt Truman. Truman, the day after Roosevelt's death, comes back to Congress and has lunch with some of his old cronies in Congress. And Vandenberg writes in his diaries, things are going to be better now. The president and Congress are going to get along better now because, he says, Truman does not have Roosevelt's contempt for Congress. He probably thought in the back of his mind, Truman doesn't know a whole lot about foreign policy anyway. The one thing Truman does know is the Senate. So we'll get to him, and he'll listen to us, and we can work these things out. And in that sense, I think he was much more optimistic after Roosevelt's death than he was when he first heard those stories about what Roosevelt agreed to at Yalta.
Wartime allies is essential to the future peace of the world.
The United Nations Conference on International Organization went ahead as planned.
The city of San Francisco turned out to greet us. I was 20 years old, and I'd never seen anything like this. This conference was the greatest in size that had ever occurred in the world. It was huge by any previous standard.
Vandenberg, in particular, was cultivated and nurtured as a part of the core elements of that delegation.
That delegation was sovereign. They had the authority to reach the decisions as to what the U.S. policy was going to be about the decisions made in San Francisco.
The United States delegation is confident that the San Francisco Conference will write a sound charter for the enduring peace.
Vandenberg's role at the conference was crucial to the charter's success.
I would almost say it could not have happened without him.
The process has led him to the kind of full-throated internationalism. He talks about creating a world organization based on justice.
Vandenberg pushed hard to make sure that word justice was prominent in the UN Charter.
What Vandenberg was saying, justice means self-determination. It means economic openness and competition. And in that sense, these were what Vandenberg believed to be absolutely essential for a functioning international system.
That also included the right of nations to band together for regional security, which Vandenberg championed in San Francisco. He saw this as a way to maintain the Western Hemisphere's Monroe Doctrine, but it also paved the way for Europe and America to organize NATO.
A staunch anti-communist, Vandenberg also served another key role in San Francisco.
This guy was tough on the Soviets from the very beginning. He was almost ultra-suspicious of what was their motives, and you can see it all through the debates that went on in San Francisco. He was always double-checking to make sure that the U.S. wasn't being rustled in some way by the Russians. Stalin was very suspicious of the United Nations and really didn't want to join. He had no great enthusiasm for it.
Vandenberg was really, really concerned about Russia. Oh, they were a threat, all right. Yes, they did. They were indeed a threat.
I think that the Cold War actually did start in San Francisco. I don't think people knew it at the time. And so it was very crucial that a person like Stettinius was able to reconcile the differing viewpoints, but many of his positions were fortified by Vandenberg. And without Vandenberg there kind of monitoring him, it's not exactly clear what would have happened in San Francisco.
There were many who doubted that agreement could ever be reached by these 50 countries, differing so much in race and religion, in language and culture. But these differences were all forgotten in one unshakable unity of determination to find a way to end wars.
The signing of the UN Charter and its eventual ratification in the U.S. Senate was a crowning achievement for Arthur Vandenberg.
Vandenberg went to San Francisco to represent the Republicans in the writing of the United Nations Charter.
I return to you with the San Francisco Charter, and without an instant's hesitation, I recommend it as man's best chance for a better, happier, and safer world.
I think the United Nations, for much of the world, is the embodiment of hope. And that's what Arthur Vandenberg dreamed of.
I think that Vandenberg would be quite pleased with the existence of the UN today. It's both a town meeting for crises and a town meeting for the boring days in between crises. A place where meetings can happen which may not have direct impact on the world at any particular time, but it co-joins different nations around common issues, and therefore means that they don't become isolated and kind of drift apart. And so for that point of view, I think Vandenberg was absolutely right. It is the town meeting of the world.
We've lived with the United Nations more than 6 decades now. We take it for granted. In today's world, we forget what a struggle it was to establish in the first place. And this is, there's a long history there. You had the League of Nations and its sort of false start after World War I and Woodrow Wilson's desperate struggle to try to get that league ratified in the U.S. Senate and to perpetuate. But I wonder, Hank, if you could tell us a little bit more, a little bit of the background of what Vandenberg, what were his days like during this period in San Francisco when he's actually negotiating and talking to people and setting out the blueprint for the world we live in today?
I think it was both this grand social occasion. I mean, San Francisco took their hosting responsibilities very seriously. And so Arthur and Hazel were and the American delegates and their counterparts from other countries, it was grand occasions all the time. But in a different way, I was thinking as you were talking, Gleaves, it can feel very arbitrary how we talk about stages in our history. But in the same way that we can talk about isolationism symbolically ending on the porch at the Grand Hotel, in a different way we can talk about the Cold War starting, as Stephen Schlesinger did, in the Fairmont Hotel in San Francisco, which happened to be where the American delegation was staying and where the Big Five, as they were known, of the U.S., Britain, Soviet Union, France, and China, would have their meetings in Stettinius's suite at the Fairmont. Because the World War II was still going on in the spring and early summer of 1945. The U.S. and the Soviets were allies, and all the big wartime conferences ending in Yalta were all about how do we keep cooperating to win the war. And now all of a sudden the war's still going on, and there's this sort of this facade of amicability among the powers and between the U.S. and the Russians. But out in San Francisco, the Americans and the Russians are at loggerheads over who can veto what and what can be talked about at this UN. And Vandenberg, as the most ardent and anti-communist and the most suspicious of the American delegates about Soviet intentions, is leading this debate with the Russians. And so war's still going on. We're still allies over in Europe and against the Japanese. But here is the Cold War sort of breaking out quietly in the suite at the Fairmont Hotel. So that's the start of another significant era.
I love the way you pull together the two hotels to frame that.
Hadn't thought about that.
Yeah, right. I think there's a revision for your book.
Yep. Endless.
Mike, this is such a remarkable segment of the documentary because it is the architecture of the world we live in today. You're seeing it, the foundation being laid. What were the challenges for you? I mean, you found some interesting people with a local angle, to be sure, to tell this story.
We went to New York a number of times, and on one of our trips we interviewed Stephen Schlesinger, and followed by Gillian Martin Sorensen. And they had all of this knowledge about not only Vandenberg, but the history of the United Nations. And it was Gillian Martin Sorensen who gave us the tip on, oh, you should interview Larry Finkelstein. I don't know where he is, but he was ascribed to the UN or to the American delegation, so we discovered him. So that all started with that interview we did in one of the hotels in New York, right across the street from the UN. We did locate quite a bit of good footage at the National Archive, and at the UN has an archive as well, and got some great B-roll, and then a lot of still photos obviously exist from the conference in 1945. So it just all came together.
Very good. Well, I think we're ready for the last segment.
The last segment we want to show you is the final piece of the film, and I think it's the most important part of the film. If you can bear with me and sit through the credits, that's an important thing to tell you, because this took a number of people to put together, and I wanted to personally thank a number of the people who worked on this film, beyond the three of us. Milt Klingensmith, who is here tonight, he is the artist, and you'll see a little bit more of his work in this piece. Our WGVU TV broadcast partners, thank you for being a part of this. Mike Mishler, who's, I don't know if he's here tonight, but he was one of the cameramen who filmed some of the video interviews. A special thank you to Ion Post, to Todd Rolenhagen, and who was our story editor and creative director and primary editor, and to Ted Harrison, who did a lot of the heavy lifting in the edit. The soundtrack is a very strong part of the documentary. That was done by the Soundpost, and thank you to Stuart Poltrock and his staff for doing such a wonderful job. You'll notice, I'm sure you've already picked out Susan Stamberg, the narrator from NPR. We chose her because she has such a great voice. She could, as they say, read the telephone book and make it sound like War and Peace. But I think she's a real strength for the piece. I already mentioned Susan Hormuth, who's the archivist in Washington, D.C. Certainly the Hauenstein Center and Grand Valley. And we already talked about the donors who helped us fund this project, and thank you to them. So anything you want to add?
Yes, I certainly want to recognize also Vice President here at Grand Valley, Matt McLogan, who is the Vice President who oversees WGVU, for all the assistance he provided as well.
Good. This is the final segment of the piece, and I think it gives you the best insight into Vandenberg and what we can learn from him. People would ask us as we were doing this, what would Vandenberg, how would he feel if he were here today, considering what's going on in Washington? And my pat answer is I don't think he would get a Christmas card from what's his name, Norquist.
Grover Norquist.
Grover Norquist. He was a centrist. He was a moderate. He believed that solutions are found in the trenches of compromise. And as you'll see in this piece, we can take away that it's okay for politicians to change their mind. Vandenberg is a prime example of someone who changed his mind. And we often look at politicians today who and accuse them of being flip-floppers, and maybe that's true, but to legitimately change your mind because the world changes, I think is a hallmark to Senator Vandenberg. So this piece is called "And This Too Shall Pass." So why don't we roll that now?
That summer of 1949, Vandenberg's doctors found a lesion on his left lung. The prognosis was not good. The senator kept a plaque on his desk, and he asked the Library of Congress to explore the origin of its message, ancient Persian, that read, "And this too shall pass." But sadly, Vandenberg's failing health would not pass. He gave one more powerful speech before the Senate. It was his last official address.
I want the Republican Party to be liberal enough to march with
The mood in Washington had shifted in a partisan direction. Truman needed him less. McCarthyism was loosed upon the land, with Taft's tacit encouragement in the absence of Vandenberg to temper it.
And even if there were only one communist in the State Department, even if there were only one communist in the State Department, that would still be one communist too many.
And war broke out in Korea.
The United Nations sent an army to Korea under a single command.
With his cherished bipartisanship threatened, his health failing, Vandenberg slipped out of Washington and went home to Michigan. From his sickbed in Grand Rapids, Vandenberg wrote that he had no illusions and that his internment was a source of constant regret. In the summer of 1950, Hazel died. America's senator was suddenly alone. Now dying, pale and drawn, his dark eyes unnaturally large, Arthur Vandenberg writhed in his own painful isolation.
Hear it now. The Columbia Broadcasting System and 173 affiliated radio stations present a document for ear based on the week's news and the men and women who made it.
In his dying days, Vandenberg corresponded with Edward R. Murrow at CBS. Murrow hoped to produce a Hear It Now radio documentary about the Cold War in the shadow of the atomic bomb.
Never holding himself up as a prophet, Arthur Vandenberg said this about what could cause a war.
In my opinion, if it happens, it will come from some tragically unfortunate incident, which may well be the result of somebody's miscalculation as to how far we will tolerate some policy which either threatens our own security or world peace, or which violates our conception of human rights and fundamental freedoms.
Murrow knew Vandenberg was sick. He planned to ask actor Spencer Tracy to read the senator's lines.
It means that we strive by consultation to lift foreign policy above partisan issues. It means that we attempt to hammer out...
With Vandenberg on his deathbed, Murrow's Hear It Now program was never produced. Ravaged by cancer, in pain even the addiction to morphine could no longer mask, Arthur Vandenberg died at his home on Morris Avenue. 3 days after Vandenberg died, Murrow broadcast a special radio tribute to America's senator.
There are 96 seats in the Senate of the United States, but for the past 2 years, the important seat and desk just off the right aisle had been noticeably vacant. On Wednesday evening, it became officially vacant.
I shall be back in Michigan when the General Assembly of the United Nations finishes in New York.
That was the voice of Senator Vandenberg after the Paris Conference in 1946. Now he is back in Michigan for the last time, and for all time. It is our purpose for the remaining minutes of tonight's program to say a few words for Arthur Vandenberg. In the last letter we received from him, he said, "The grave need is to find a meeting of the minds which will assure our own country and the world that our democracy can function in time of crisis." We are now divided, bitterly, hysterically. Congressmen and ordinary citizens are, in Senator Vandenberg's phrase, consulting partisan rather than national destiny. Arthur Vandenberg, in the later years of his political life, was like George Patton. He never bothered about his flanks, drove straight ahead. Those on his right and left are now in confusion and contention, and he is silent. But Vandenberg had much of Lincoln's faith in the people. Had he lived, he would have gloried in this controversy, and he would have steadied it. And he would have been confident that in the end of the day, the little men of loud voice and small faith, those who consult partisan rather than national destiny, will yield to the collective changing judgment of the American people. Arthur Vandenberg was a little more than life-size in the field of foreign policy. His party and his nation are poorer for his passing. It was our inclination and our duty to try to say so.
The great lesson we take from the life of Arthur Vandenberg is his capacity to change, and by doing so, to help change the way Americans think about our place in the world.
We might want to think about why it is we don't allow our lawmakers to change, why it is we always deem it hypocrisy when they change. People change when the times change. Vandenberg was an example of that.
Vandenberg certainly had a claim on being one of the standouts of the Senate for his ability to put the national interest above the interests of his party. And all those other people on the wall of the Senate chamber, the ones who were honored by the Senate as greats of Senate history, had that ability. Now, many of them were staunch members of their party at one time or another, but they all had the ability to transcend party.
That's part of the lesson today, which is that you need people who can reach across the aisles, who can reach between the branches of government and help define a larger sense of national interest in a world in which we constantly encounter new challenges and new risks.
I want the Republican Party to be liberal enough to march with the times, to dare new answers to new problems, and to use the power and strength and initiative of government to help citizens to help themselves when they confront problems beyond their own resources and their own control. I want the oak to stand, but I want the branches to grow.